My name is Paul Litton. I'm an associate dean here at the law school. Welcome to everyone. Thank you for coming. Special welcome to those of you who are coming from beyond our law school community. Welcome. It is my privilege today to introduce our keynote speaker for our One Read program. We began our One Read program at a time when we believed that we could build a stronger community here at the law school, a stronger sense of community, and that a One Read program would help us achieve that goal, particularly by reading books that shed light on the diversity of human experiences, especially books that could also provide value in preparation for representing clients with very different backgrounds. To that end, this year we read The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, a story with which now we're all familiar. We've had events throughout the year, but today is our keynote talk, and it's my privilege to introduce our speaker. Dorothy Roberts is the George A. Weiss University Professor of Law and Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Roberts is also the founding director of the program on Race, Science, and Society at Penn's Center for Africana Studies. She's a graduate of Yale College and Harvard Law School. She clerked for the United States District Court for the Southern District, and she practiced for a number of years at a large firm in New York City before entering the academy. She's been on the faculty at Northwestern. She's been a visitor or a fellow at Stanford, at Rutgers, at Harvard. Her publications are too numerous to really count, but they include 3 authored books, including Fatal Invention, How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century, Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare, and Killing the Black Body, Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty. Her awards, also too numerous to mention, but most recently she was named a 2016 Woman Inspiring Change by the Harvard Law and International Development Society and the Harvard's Women's Law Association. Notably, she has spoken multiple times about Henrietta Lacks' story in different contexts, and today she's presenting Henrietta Lacks and the Future of Race, Science, and Justice. Please join me in welcoming Professor Roberts to Mizzou Law. I'll let you know. Professor Roberts will talk for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have a Q&A session.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Litton, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak in your One Read program on this terrific book about this very important woman who was at the intersection of race, science, and justice. So I would like to put her story in the context of that intersection between race, science, and justice, and look at how the scientific and ethical issues raised in the book relate to systems of inequality, in particular race, gender, and wealth, how they're related to current debates about science and social inequality, and what lessons about these debates we can draw from her story. So first I want to ask the question, did Henrietta Lacks' race matter to her cancer? We know that she was treated in a segregated patients ward, a ward for Black patients. A ward that we now know in the hindsight of the civil rights movement was separate and unequal. We were talking at lunch today about the claim that she got the same treatment, or maybe even better treatment than white patients in the white ward. But we know that separate institutions were created in this country to support white supremacy and the notions of white racial purity and white superiority. And it is absurd to think that she got as good treatment as she would have were she a white patient. Also, we have to ask questions about her cancer and whether or not the idea of a black woman with cancer was seen the same as a woman from another race with cancer. We have to look at issues like different survival rates from cancer and notions about biological difference between the way in which cancer would operate in a black person's body versus a white person's body. In 2006, there was a study revealed that occurred in Chicago looking at differences in deaths from breast cancer among women, black and white women living in Chicago. And the study found that although black women had a slightly lower incidence of cancer, they were twice as likely to die from breast cancer as white women. This wasn't 1956, this was 2006. In fact, the study found that there were 111 excess deaths to black women in Chicago in 2005 because their breast cancer mortality rate was not the same as the white rate. In other words, if black and white women had the same rate of death from breast cancer in Chicago in 2005, 111 black women would still have been alive who had died that year from breast cancer. Now, we might be astounded that this happened in 2006, but something even more astounding was that the doctors, medical researchers who did the study, found that in 1980, the death rate from breast cancer between black and white women was exactly the same. Let's see, if you see here in 1980, this is the black death rate, this is the white death rate. And what happened was over the course of 20 years, the white death rate was cut in half and the black death rate stayed the same. So this isn't a story of advances in breast cancer treatment and detection for all women. It's the story of those advances for white women, but black women in Chicago didn't experience any of those advances. They didn't get the benefit of any of those advances. Now, why is that? You know, we could take from that story that probably Henrietta Lacks, her cancer was different in some way from cancer among white women at the time, probably because of, in part at least, her access to cancer care, but also maybe because of differences in her living conditions than those conditions of white people at the time. And it's important to think about the way in which race and medicine have coincided. Her story raises this question about the relationship between notions of race and the way in which medicine is practiced. Not just the fact that there were separate medical facilities for black and white people at Johns Hopkins, but also the way in which black people's diseases were seen as different from white people's diseases. And this all goes back to the very invention of the concept of race. The very notion that people of different races are biologically distinct from each other, that race is a natural category, a natural division between human beings, and that human beings are divided into this handful of groups that are so distinct from each other that we can call them biological races. Well, the truth is that that is an invented concept. Just like the concept of dividing people, human beings, into races was invented. We know that it was a concept that originated in the 1500s, that was really defined more precisely by European typologists in the 1600s and 1700s, and really achieved its precise definitions of racial categories in the United States in the 1800s. Further refined under Jim Crow law in the 1900s. So by the time Henrietta Lacks was being treated for cervical cancer in the 1950s, there had been a whole several centuries worth of promulgation of this idea that human beings are biologically divided into races. Invented by scientists and philosophers to support slavery and colonialism and conquest of non-white people. And of course, when Europeans invented this notion of separate races, they always made Europeans at the top of the hierarchy and black people at the bottom. In fact, many asserted that blacks were closer to animals and were not even the same species as white people. And medicine supported this view with the idea that because people of different races were biologically distinct, they had to be treated medically in distinct ways, and their diseases were different from each other. They argued that there was a racial concept of disease, that people of different races suffered from different diseases and experienced common diseases like cervical or breast cancer differently on the basis of race. Now, as I mentioned, this categorization of races and theories about biological differences between them was really perfected in the United States during slavery, because it was a theory to support slavery, to justify slavery. And one of its chief proponents was Dr. Samuel Cartwright, who was trained at University of Pennsylvania Medical School, my university. And he was commissioned by the Medical Society of Louisiana to examine the peculiar diseases of the Negro race. And he published his report in 1851, and he listed a number of diseases that were peculiar to black people, all of which supported the need to enslave black people for their health. One of the interesting diseases he noted was one he coined gepetomania, which was the disease that caused Negroes to flee plantations. Because in his theory, if you were a black person, you would have to have a mental disorder not to want to be enslaved, because slavery was good for you. His primary idea was that black people had lower lung capacity than whites, and so they had to be forced to work in order to be healthy. And he said in the medical journal, "It is the red vital blood sent to the brain that liberates their mind when under the white man's control, and it is the want of a sufficiency of red vital blood that changed their mind to ignorance and barbarism when in freedom." And notice how this pernicious idea of biologically distinct races could support the view that black people were chained when in freedom, but were liberated when in slavery. It's to me, one of the most remarkable examples of how racist ideas can actually distort reality, reverse reality. Talk about alternative facts. This is a real alternative fact. Now, you might say, oh, well, that was the 1800s. But what about today or when Henrietta Lacks was being treated? Well, in fact, today, medical students continue to be taught that one of the very first things you should notice about a patient is their race, and that you should interpret their symptoms according to their race, diagnose their illness according to their race, and treat them according to their race. Sally Satel, a conservative psychiatrist, wrote a very prominent article in the New York Times Magazine. It was a cover story. I am a racially profiling doctor. Illness isn't colorblind, so why is it taboo for doctors to take note of a patient's race? Well, she was right that she is a racially profiling doctor, but she was absolutely wrong when she said that it's taboo for doctors to take note of a patient's race. It's not taboo at all. It's normal medical practice in the United States to take account of a patient's race. But like many people who are trying to defend an indefensible position, they paint themselves as if they're heroes, champions of the truth, when no one else is willing to tell the truth. But in fact, she wasn't saying anything new. But she did admit that she, when prescribing medications for psychiatric problems, always begins Black people on a lower dose than she does her other patients. Now, I'll get to in a minute why that might be, that doctors would prescribe certain medications at a lower dose to Black people than to others. But not only do doctors routinely do this, but some aspects of this notion of the racial concept of disease rooted in biological differences between races are actually embedded into the very technology that doctors use. So the spirometer, which was invented in 1846, actually in England, to measure breathing among coal miners, brought into the United States. Dr. Samuel Cartwright grabbed it, perfected it in order to measure the lower lung capacity of Black people, which he believed didn't come from the environment, like working in coal mines. He said Black people naturally had lower lung capacity, and so he made the machine to automatically correct for racial differences in lung capacity, because his view was any Black person breathing into the machine naturally has lower lung capacity, so you would have to reduce what would be normal for a Black person in the measurement of abnormality in breathing. And today, there are some versions of the spirometer that still have a button for race, so that doctors can correct categorically for Black people's lower lung capacity. Here's another example that is typical in measuring for glomerular filtration rate, which is one of the important indicators of kidney function. And you see here, this is how the blood test comes out. It's a measure of a protein that is filtered passes through muscle, and it measures the quantity of blood helps to measure the quantity of blood filtered through the kidney. That is an indicator of whether or not the doctor should be concerned that the patient is at risk for kidney disease. And so this is a certain amount of this protein in the blood, right? So that amount of protein in the blood is measured differently, you can see, for a non-African American and an African American patient. Let me repeat. You are a patient, you have a certain amount of this protein in your blood that is an indicator of kidney function, and the doctor will either look at you or ask you if you are an African American. If you are an African American, it is a one reading, and if you are not an African American, it is a different reading. Automatically. So you might ask, well, let's say this is Barack Obama's test. It all depends on whether or not we think Barack Obama is a Black man with a white mother or a white man with a Black father. Same man, same amount of protein in his blood, but depending on your legal definition of race, which has nothing to do with your biology, that social definition is going to change the doctor's interpretation of whether you are at risk for kidney disease or not, automatically in the blood test. I don't know about you, but I'm shocked. I'm shocked that this is routine in medical practice today. And just one reflection of how doctors automatically take account of race. And by the way, I looked into how could this possibly be? And I discovered that it was because there is an assumption that black people as a group have greater muscle mass than white people or not any other race as a group. And so the blood test reading takes into account the greater muscle mass of the African American patient, regardless of the muscle mass of the patient standing right there in front of the doctor. Again, an example where race overcomes even what the doctor is seeing before her eyes. It's race that matters rather than the actual amount of protein in the patient's blood or the actual muscle mass that the patient has. I could go on and on with many, many examples like this, but let me focus on one example that I think shows the great harm of race-based medicine based in this concept of racial biological distinctions, and that is the treatment of black patients' pain. And you have to wonder whether or not this was part of the treatment that Henrietta Lacks got. Again, don't tell me that doctors treated patients in the colored ward the same way when we have evidence that today doctors treat black patients' pain very differently than other patients' pain, especially white patients' pain. There are many studies that find that doctors undertreat black patients' pain. They do not give black patients the same medical care for their pain as they give white patients. One study finding, for example, that blacks are half as likely as whites to receive any pain medication at all for long bone fractures, which are painful to everybody, unless, of course, you believe, as some doctors do, that black people's bones are different from white people's bones. Some doctors have said to me when I present this evidence to them, well, it's because black people don't express their pain the way that white people do, and I can't tell they're in pain. Well, this study that came out a couple of years ago found that even children screaming in pain from severe appendicitis, they're not hiding their pain. They are far, far less likely to receive opioid pain treatment than white children. Now, why is this? I have always believed that it is because many doctors have racial stereotypes about biological differences, including those that affect pain, that black people don't feel pain because their bodies are physically different. Their bodies don't experience pain like white people experience pain. That black people exaggerate their pain because of the stereotype that black people are emotional and not rational. And so they're not rationally thinking about their pain, any little amount of pain. Now, this contradicts the first stereotype, but somehow it can exist as well. And in fact, I have had nurses tell me they were trained that if a black person says on a scale of 1 to 10, my pain is 10, you reduce it to 5 because they're probably exaggerating it. And so you just treat them for the 5, not the 10. And the other is that black people are predisposed to drug addiction and white people aren't. So you can prescribe opioid painkillers to whites and not fear drug addiction, but you better not prescribe it to black people. Also that black people make up pain to get drugs. This has been found to be extremely harmful to patients with sickle cell disease who are in extreme pain and are put through the ringer to prove they're in pain because doctors believe they're pretending just to get drugs. Now, this idea was confirmed in a study that just came out last April at UVA Medical School that found that a substantial number of white lay people and medical students and residents who were treating patients held false beliefs about biological differences between blacks and whites. For example, that black people's skin is thicker than white people's skin, and so they don't feel pain the same. That black people's nerve endings are less sensitive than white people's nerve endings. This is not the 1800s. This is last year at UVA Medical School of residents treating patients. And it's not just UVA, as I showed you, studies around the country have shown this. And they also found that these beliefs predict the racial bias in pain perception and pain treatment. Now, just as an aside, I want to point out that there's now some evidence that this racial stereotyping about pain not only hurts black people, it hurts white people. It was discovered a couple years ago, this astounding fact that the white death rate is increasing in the United States. Everybody else's death rate is going down. The black death rate is still higher than the white death rate, but it's going down, which you would expect in an advanced democracy like the United States. Everyone's death rate should be going down, and the gap should be decreasing. But the gap is decreasing here because white people's death rate is going up. And why is that? It's been associated with two phenomena. One, the huge spike in poisoning. This poisoning is predominantly deaths from drug overdoses. And the other is increase in suicide among white people. This poisoning has been attributed to the over-medication, over-prescription of opioid painkillers to white people, white patients. So doctor stereotypes that white people will not become addicted and black people will, thereby over-prescribing opioid painkillers to whites, under-prescribing to blacks, could be the reason why we see this difference in the trend of death rates. I think there's a strong argument that this racial stereotype has hurt black patients by undertreating their pain, but has also hurt white patients by making them addicted to opioid painkillers that have led to this huge spike in deaths from drug overdoses among whites. Okay, well, what about the race and research ethics issues that come up in the Henrietta Lacks case? Rebecca Skloot points out in the book that many doctors of the era where her cancer cells were harvested used patients from the public wards for research, usually without their knowledge, as happened to Henrietta Lacks. And why was that? Because they had this idea that because the patients were treated for free, it was fair to use them as research objects. They traded in their free treatment because they were too poor for their exploitation and it wasn't seen as exploitation, but the use of their bodies as research subjects. And in fact, there is a long history in the United States of medical exploitation, experimentation, and neglect of black patients. Harriet Washington details this in her best-selling book, Medical Apartheid. And let me just talk about a few aspects of it. Probably everyone here has heard about the Tuskegee Experiment that lasted all the way up to 1972. Actually, I think it's a bit of a misnomer. To call it a Tuskegee experiment. It happened in Tuskegee, but it was actually a US government health service experiment that failed to treat black sharecroppers in Alabama with syphilis even though treatments were available, so that they would die from syphilis and their bodies could be autopsied to look for racial differences in the way that syphilis affected black people versus white people. So again, a combination of this idea of black biological difference combined with the idea that black people's bodies could be subject to experimentation and this false justification that it was actually to benefit them. Let them die for their own benefit so we can learn more about how their different bodies are affected by syphilis. Sorry. I want to focus especially, though, on the particular devaluation of black women's bodies in the history of the United States, and particularly in medicine and medical research. In her files, Rebecca Skloot found the note that Henrietta Lacks was told she couldn't have any more children, and she said if she had been told this before, she wouldn't have gone through with the treatment for cervical cancer. And I think this reflects both the paternalistic attitude toward her that the doctors had, not telling her everything she needed to know for a true informed consent about her treatment, as well as the taking of her cells, but also the devaluation of black women as mothers, that her childbearing wasn't important. Now, this goes back to the history of slavery in the United States, where black women were valuable for their reproductive labor as well as their physical labor. And of course, their childbearing was what fueled the slavery industry. Black women produced children who were, the minute they were conceived, property of the owner of the enslaved woman, unless the owner had already sold the fetus or devised the fetus to someone else in a will. The fetus was already the property of the owner to do with what he wanted. And so the notion that black women's childbearing was to be controlled and regulated was not part of their own liberty, was it that their bodies were literally not their own. They were property, has left a long legacy in the United States of devaluing black women's decisions about their own childbearing. In the 1800s, Dr. J. Marion Sims, who has plaques and statues in his honor because he's seen as the father of modern gynecology, conducted experiments on enslaved women without anesthesia in order to perfect his various gynecological surgeries. And you might note in this picture, it's hard to see here, but the floor here is covered in blood from the surgeries that he conducted on enslaved women. And the eugenicist practice of sterilizing people who were deemed unfit to be parents, especially women deemed unfit to be mothers, upheld by the 1927 case Buck versus Bell, where Oliver Wendell Holmes approved the eugenic sterilization of Carrie Buck, mandatory sterilization based on the view that she was feeble-minded, all made up, but the main thing was that the US Supreme Court affirmed the practice of coercively sterilizing people without their consent because they were deemed unfit to be parents and unfit to have offspring brought into our society. That idea, even though most eugenics programs ended with World War II, when it was revealed that that very theory that was perfected in the United States was adopted by the Nazis and led to the genocide of Jews and other people in Germany and other parts of Europe and other parts of the world, actually. It did not end with World War II. What happened after World War II was that these theories were used to target primarily poor Black women, Latino women, Native American women who were deemed unfit to be mothers, deemed to be overly fertile, and that they should be forced to be sterilized in order to support public policy in the United States. One example is the North Carolina Eugenics Board that operated until 1973. Very similar story as the Tuskegee Experiment, also going on until around the exact same year, where a newspaper reporter finds out about it, reveals it, and it's finally shut down. But in the last decade of its operation, it was primarily mandating the sterilization of poor Black women who were on welfare as a way to cut the welfare rolls in North Carolina. And the North Carolina legislature was the first to pass a law providing some reparations to the victims of these horrific policies in North Carolina. Of course, most states in the country had mandatory sterilization laws, not just North Carolina. California sterilized more people than any other state in the nation. And there is a move today to get reparations for the victims of these sterilization laws in California as well. Another aspect of the ethics of the use of Henrietta Lacks's cells is who pays and who profits from them. Her cells were used against her will, but to benefit millions of people. But her own children could not benefit from them because they didn't have health insurance that could have paid for the medications that their mother's cells helped to create. And so Deborah Lacks points out in The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, I would like some health insurance so I don't got to pay all that money every month for drugs my mother's cells probably helped to make. One of the injustices of this case is not just the taking of her cells, it's that they were taken in the context of a healthcare system that doesn't provide the ability for everyone to have access to the medications and treatments that her cells helped to create. She was in a segregated ward, but her children may not have been in a segregated ward. That was abolished, officially abolished, although there are many hospitals in the United States that are still segregated, but de facto segregated. It's not mandated, but because we live in a segregated society with segregated communities in many, many parts of this country, the hospitals located there in those communities are also segregated. But the part of the lasting legacy is the lack of access to adequate medical care by many, many people in this country. Now, you would hope that everything I've said is getting better. But let me just speak on one aspect of how things are getting worse. I mean, I could also go on about how access to medical care is probably going to get worse. But I want to go back to what I was saying about the very biological concept of race that no doubt affected Henrietta Lacks's medical treatment. And in 2000, the map of the human genome was unveiled in a glorious White House ceremony where everyone involved declared that it showed that race was not written in our genes. President Clinton famously said, in genetic terms, all human beings, regardless of race, are more than 99.9% the same. And he should have added that that 0.1% of genetic difference is not divided by race. It's the difference that we see between individuals. You know, every individual is genetically unique, except for maybe identical twins, but even their gene expression is affected by social factors even within the womb. So there's lots of genetic variation within groups, more within groups that we call races than between groups that we call races. You know, all black people are not the same. All white people are not the same. All Asian people aren't the same. So lots of genetic variation. People in the south of Africa are very genetically different from people in the north of Africa. But those differences are not grouped together into 4 or 5 distinguishable, genetically distinguishable races. So it seemed as if we were now on the cusp of the brink of a new genomic revolution where genomic researchers, biomedical researchers, and just everyday people would stop relying on biological concepts of race to understand human diversity. We would understand that there is a huge amount of human genetic unity and that the diversity isn't grouped by race. Now, I'm not saying that we don't have racial groupings in the United States. We do. And they affect people's very lives. But those, as I said at the beginning, are social groupings. They're not natural. They were invented in order to support racism. That's the only reason they exist. And I do believe in order to combat racism, we have to be aware of the very powerful effect of race. But that's very different from believing that there is a natural division among human beings by race. Unfortunately, what happened was that many researchers began to use the genetic information that came out of the Human Genome Project to look for genetic differences between human races. And so what seemed to be the beginning of an exciting new science of race ended up being the same old ideas about race that came out of the 15, 16, 1700s, same categories, but now dressed up in new genomic language and technologies. I wrote a book called Fatal Invention: How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century to address this phenomenon I was saying that didn't make sense to me. And I found that indeed there were scientists who were defining race as a biological category written in our genes, that the biotech and pharmaceutical industries were creating race-specific products based on this false concept of biological difference, and that it was happening at a time when we were being told that we were in a post-racial society, and yet there was all this attention to racial difference. And my argument in the book is that biological difference then becomes an excuse for societal differences that persist, societal inequalities that persist. People can say, oh, well, that's because black people and white people are just different, biologically different from each other. That's why we have blacks have higher rates of incarceration. That's why blacks have higher rates of deaths from breast cancer and heart failure and diabetes. That's why blacks don't do as well in school. It's all because of biological difference instead of the truth, which is it's because of long-lasting and current institutionalized barriers that still exist in this country. Among the aspects of this race-specific biology, new forms of race-specific thinking in biology, is race-specific medicine. I'll just throw this out as one example where the Food and Drug Administration in 2006 approved a drug for self-identified African Americans. Again, I ask, what drug should Barack Obama use? But self-identified African Americans to treat heart failure. It's a drug called Bidil, and it is just the combination of two generic drugs that had been used without any regard to race for 20 years. Doctors have prescribed these drugs without regard. The cardiologist, not geneticist, cardiologist who patented this drug figured out how to combine them in one pill, which he called Bidil. The combination of the drugs dilate the blood vessels, so they make human hearts pump more easily. And so that relieves the pressure on patients who have heart failure, and it makes it easier for them to recover from heart failure. Well, that's how it works. No regard to race. His first patent didn't mention race, but the FDA wouldn't approve it because he didn't conduct a new clinical trial using that drug. And so by the time he went through the whole procedures, the FDA turned him down. His patent was going to expire. He needed a new patent with a novel claim. He added that it was for black patients. Same formula, nothing changed. Okay, so for commercial reasons, he made it a race-specific drug. The FDA said, well, we'll approve it if you conduct a clinical trial on black patients and it works. He did that. It worked because it dilated their blood vessels and they had a huge increase in survival. And the FDA said, okay, we'll approve it for black patients. Now, some people said, oh, that's great. Black people have a drug just for them. There were also some people who said, I'm not using that drug. I want the drug for white people. But to me, the message was black people's bodies, their hearts work differently from other human beings. And so if the drug works on them, we have no guarantee it'll work on other people. I thought it was a very horrible message. Now, how could the FDA do that? Well, the head of the advisory committee said, we're using self-identified race as a surrogate for genetic markers. What? These were all cardiologists, so they didn't know anything about genetic markers. The clinical trial didn't include genetic markers. This is just based on that same old theory that black people are genetically different from other human beings, and so we can use race. And note, he has to say self-identified race because that's all they had. So how is self-identified race a proxy for genetic difference? I go back to Barack Obama. Whether you think he's a black patient who should use this drug has nothing to do with his genes. It's your social definition of him. Now, the way I like to look at this is that it is racism that is causing these biological differences in rates of disease and survival of disease. So race isn't a biological category that is naturally producing health disparities because of genetic differences, but it is a real political category that does have real impact on our lives, our health, our welfare, our opportunities in this country. And it also, among all of those effects, are biological effects that are because social inequality is the biggest determinant of health. We've known this for so long, that your place in the social hierarchy is what has the biggest impact on your health. This was proven in England decades ago, where it was shown that the upper classes in England have the best health and the lower classes have the worst health. That wasn't based on race, that was based on economic benefit and welfare privilege. But it applies as well to the intersection of race and economic welfare in America. So let me conclude with another lesson that the story of Henrietta Lacks teaches us. Many people have noted the amazing aspects of the HeLa cells. This is probably what most people think about when they think about the Henrietta Lacks story, is that her cells were incredible. They multiplied like no other cells ever had, and for that reason could be used to investigate many, many different kinds of treatments that have helped millions upon millions of people all over the world. Francis Collins, head of NIH, says that that's why it was so significant in 1951 that this barrier was overcome for the first time. And he's talking about the barrier of cells not reproducing. Her cells cut through that barrier and continued perpetually to reproduce themselves. And I want to focus, though, on another kind of barrier that Henrietta Lacks' cells broke. And that was despite everything I've said about the biological concept of race and the racial concept of disease. Her cells could be used to create cures for people regardless of race. Here is this black woman in the South in the 1950s who was looked upon as being biologically distinct, who no doubt was the victim of all of the stereotypes and concepts I've been talking about, the devaluation of black women's bodies. And yet her cells broke through that barrier to be useful for the lives of people all around the globe. It's a wonderful story of how race does not biologically categorize us, of how we have a common humanity. And so her cells could help all of humanity. In her prologue, Rebecca Skloot writes, I've tried to imagine how she'd feel, Henrietta would feel, knowing that her cells went up in the first space missions to see what would happen to human cells in zero gravity, or that they have helped with some of the most important advances in medicine, the polio vaccine, chemotherapy, cloning, gene mapping, in vitro fertilization. All of these, every one of these, she and people like her would have had difficulty accessing. And I can't even begin, looking at cloning, gene mapping, and in vitro fertilization, how race affects the very way we even think about who is entitled to produce more children, what we think about who would be good clones, who should we clone in our society, what is the image of the person who should be cloned, who should be reproduced. Race has such a profound effect on that. I have a book called Killing the Black Body where I look at images of cloning and in vitro fertilization and high-tech reproduction and now gene editing. Can we create perfect children? Look at those images. They're always images of white children with blonde hair and blue eyes, always. Where there are multiple children, what our future should look like, lots and lots of white babies. All the stories that come out of the new reproduction that involve black children are always where it was a mistake. It was a mistake that a black child was produced. And a white person sues for damages because they got a black child instead of a white child. So all of this, it's not just the access to these medical technologies and advances, but the very way we conceive of medical advances, so full of race and racism and stereotyping, and yet she broke that barrier where her genes, her cells, could be used to help all of humanity. And so I'll end with the call that instead of continuing down this path of racialized medicine and scientific exploration and research and treatment and the very way we think about people's bodies and diseases, so rooted in a biological concept of race, that we truly break from that and affirm our shared humanity by working to end the social injustices preserved by the political system of race. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dorothy.
Sure.
Is this on? Yeah.
Yes.
That was great. So now we have time for questions.
Sure, I would love. Can you help me call on people?
Yeah, yeah,
okay.
For sure.
Because I can't notice who has their hand up first.
Please, just go ahead.
And then, I noticed you. Okay, sure.
So I would take a more nuanced view than I think you've articulated.
Yeah.
I mean, I certainly recognize, as many of us or all of us do, the injustices, but I think given the very brief time that a doctor has in an encounter with a patient, to not recognize race as having, in fact, a likely influence on a particular prevalence of a disease would be an injustice to the patient. And most easily is the case of sickle cell. The frequency of sickle cell trait in the African American population is 5 times that of the average trait. And so an encounter, if someone comes in with a problem that is manifested as a sickle cell trait, for the physician to not immediately count that, count race as being a possible significant factor, I think would be an injustice to the individual. How do you respond to that?
Okay, I respond to that by saying, first of all, race is too crude a category to use given the technologies we have, the knowledge we have. I wouldn't say that ancestry, there's anything wrong with ancestry. That is much more precise, that has more to do with the individual. But race is a huge social category that is just too imprecise for doctors to use. So, and it also overwhelms, in many cases, doctors' actual perception of the patient's symptoms and leads to a misdiagnosis. So the myth that only Black people, and I know you said prevalence, you didn't say only, but many of these decisions are made categorically. Like the GFR rate, where it's categorically, if you're Black, it's this, if you're white, it's this, if you're Asian, this, Native American, that, and it's not nuanced. I actually want a more nuanced view, so that there are patients, Black patients, for example, who have cystic fibrosis. They have all the symptoms of cystic fibrosis. If they were white, the doctor would immediately diagnose cystic fibrosis and treat them for cystic fibrosis, but because of the categorical myth that Black people can't have it, they go untreated because the idea is, well, you're Black, you couldn't have it. Well, yes, a Black person can have it, just like a white person. Yes, the prevalence is lower, but a white person can have sickle cell disease. And especially now where you can test for the gene, pretty easily, and in fact, there is a study by Jay Kaufman and Richard Cooper showing that it's actually cost effective to test for sickle cell disease, just to test babies for it, a sickle cell trait, that we don't need to rely on race as a proxy. And then the association between certain diseases and race, especially Black race, has caused so much harm. So if we take, for example, sickle cell disease, the fact that it's seen as a Black disease has led to discrimination against Black people from certain forms of employment and athletes as well, that are not allowed to play because either they have the trait or the disease, or it's assumed that they do, and the underfunding of treatment of sickle cell, where cystic fibrosis has so much more research devoted to it to look for a cure than sickle cell, even though sickle cell affects far more people than cystic fibrosis. And then, as I mentioned, the undertreatment of pain for it as well. So to me, I think if we think about even if we take sickle cell, which is, and cystic fibrosis as, those are diseases that are so associated with particular genetic mutations, which is not true of most illness. But even if we take that difficult case, I think that it would be far more scientific, rather than thinking of them as racial diseases, to think of them as diseases that are more likely if you have a particular ancestry, and ask about the ancestry of the patient, or family history of the patient. When we look at common diseases, there are studies that show that family history can tell doctors more than all these fancy gene-wide association studies that are looking for associations between certain diseases and certain genes, that just asking the patient's family history. And I'll give another example, is the BRCA1 and 2 gene that many doctors stereotypically associate just with Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry. Now, that is just not true. It's, yes, higher prevalence among Ashkenazi Jewish people, but that doesn't mean the gene is only in those women. And so you have black women being, who have the gene and also have all the indicators that you would send them to genetic counseling, far less likely to be sent to genetic counseling, probably because doctors think, well, that person is black, they couldn't have the gene. And that's false, both because the gene can occur in populations other than Ashkenazi Jewish populations, but also because black people can have Ashkenazi Jewish heritage. It's like you can actually be an Ashkenazi Jew, and have a child with a black person, and that child will have that heritage. There are many Ashkenazi Jewish women who have black children, and their black daughters. And their black daughters may have inherited the BRCA1 and 2 gene. That's one way it could happen, but you could also not have any Ashkenazi Jewish heritage and have the BRCA1 or 2 gene. So I think relying on they're really archaic categories developed in the 1700s for doctors to rely on to treat patients is just, we can do better than that. And so I understand the dilemma. Doctors have only a certain amount of time. And one answer to that also is, can we have a better health system where doctors could spend more time with their patients? That would help. And so they wouldn't have to rely on race. But can we explore better ways for doctors to treat patients, given the possibility of misdiagnosis by relying on race? And that's my response. I think we can do better than using race as a proxy for what's really the more important factor the doctor's looking for.
I think can you hear me okay?
Sure.
Along those lines, so I serve on many NIH study sections.
Yes.
And so this is at the other arm, because this really gets to the heart of, trying to understand, the relationship of, diseases, environmental toxicants.
Right.
And one of the things that we have to do on our NIH forums is break down who would be our potential, and again, these are volunteers,
Yes.
I want to be very clear on that. These are not forced, but who would be our potential composition. And
yes.
One of the things on the NIH forum you have to generally say is, how many African Americans, how many Hispanics? And I'm trying to put, in light of your talk, how can we change, then the descriptors to have enough, because the thing you have to do is have enough people of a certain group to have a power analysis to do.
I know.
So, but we also want to make sure it's not just this all one group, the suburbs or that.
Yes.
Should we be doing geographic regions instead? What would if you had to remake that NIH form of a study composition, how would you do it to reflect the population as a whole, but to minimize the influence of race?
Right.
Based on your comments.
Yeah. Well, one guide that I think is really helpful to the NIH as well as other people funding and studying racial differences in disease, or just disease in general, where they might have an interest in the relationship between disease and racial inequality is to keep in mind what the categories are and why they're important. So even the NIH, they're using the census categories, and they acknowledge that these are social categories. It's written there in the OMB 15, is it, I think? Part of this is the reason for NIH having these racial category requirements is, number one, to include more diverse people, a group of people in clinical research, but also to attend to the health needs of minorities, which were being ignored in prior decades. So, but they acknowledge, and the other is to have a consistent group of categories across scientific research, especially biomedical research. But each of those is a different purpose, and race is being used to further all of those purposes in confusing ways. So it's one thing to say, we want to attend to the health needs of minorities that have been ignored, and so therefore we're going to pay attention to these social categories, versus we are going to divide the patient, the clinical research subjects, into races to look for biological differences between the races. So I think it's a good idea to have diversity in research and also to pay particular attention to the health needs of the most disadvantaged people in society. But NIH has to do a better job of thinking through and instructing the researchers it funds about exactly why they are using these racial categories. There's so much confusion between a social category and a biological category. For example, you use Hispanic, which the NIH does. What are Hispanics a separate biological category? Separate from what? From whites, from blacks, from Asians, from Native Americans? I mean, that doesn't even make sense. First of all, they're not a homogeneous category, socially or biologically, and their ancestry of most comes from a mixture of those groups. So it doesn't even make sense to say they're a separate racial category. Now, they're a political category. That might have some implications. So I think NIH, by the way, I participated in a meeting in November at NIH, which was generated in part from an article in Science that I co-authored. And you might want to look at this, co-authored with Michael Udell, who's a public health scholar at Drexel, Sarah Tishkoff, who's a geneticist at Penn, and Rob DeSalle, who is a geneticist at the American Museum of Natural History. It was published in February, and the title is Taking Race Out of Human Genetic Variation Research. And it lays out the case that race is a bad category to use in human genetic variation research. It calls on the National Academies of Science to have a 2-year, because it's going to take time to figure this out, 2-year investigation of how to treat race properly, because there's so much confusion about it. You can have 2 research papers that define these categories differently, treat them differently, and yet we're supposed to be able to replicate studies, we're supposed to be able to compare studies, and the definition's different. There are researchers who identify Hispanic by last name. If you have a Spanish surname, you go in the Hispanic category. What kind of scientific research is that? You know what I mean? So it's sloppy, it's not scientific. And again, like with the first, I understand these difficulties, and there's no easy answer, but there has been too long that researchers and doctors have just relied on these categories without even thinking about them. You know, you ask them. I interviewed many for my book, Fatal Invention. Some of them can't even tell you what race means, yet they're using define race. They can't do it. And yet this is a major category. How did you decide who goes into which category? You know, I keep going back to Barack Obama because everybody knows him. What category should he go into in a scientific study about cardiovascular disease, about genes, about diabetes, about the social determinants of health? Is he black for all of those? Should we have a separate category for mixed ancestry? These are important questions, and NIH it's working on it. It's working on it, and hopefully hopefully this National Academies project will go forward, and there can be some serious attention paid to sorting this out and going forward in a more scientific way.
Earlier you were talking about how the statistics of the black people who didn't get the medical attention that they needed because they were black. And I'm wondering...
Oh, the pain medication? Yeah.
How much of that do you think actually came from other contributors, such as not having health insurance?
Oh, okay. Well, that can be a factor. That can be a factor that doctors will not prescribe the most expensive medication because a patient doesn't have insurance to cover it. That can be a factor. But in the studies that I cited, health insurance was controlled for. So, in most of these studies, they will control for other factors to try to show as well as they can that race was the reason why. And so, but you raise a good point that lack of health insurance can also affect what medications are prescribed. And even if the doctor does prescribe it and you can't afford it, what good is it? That's a very important question in access to health care, is being able to pay, because sometimes the medications are cost more than every other aspect of the treatment. I mean, if you've ever gone, hopefully everyone here is covered with health insurance, but I've gone and gotten a prescription and I pay $10 and I look at the actual price and it's $200. It's like, what? I was supposed to pay if I didn't have this insurance? How could I possibly? That's expensive for me, let alone somebody where $200 is all they have for food for months, maybe even. Yeah.
So with the trend of more and more people having children with others that don't necessarily look like themselves, and more Barack Obamas.
Right.
Do you think that'll have positive implications and sort of remedy these categories on their own, or do you think people in power and medical practitioners will kind of always find a way to categorize people and in a way to make sure resources and care isn't allocated equally?
Yeah, that is an excellent, excellent question. You're right that the numbers of people who identify as mixed race are going up. It's not possible to show that on the census. That used to not be the case. Although at one point there was mulatto was a category in some of the early censuses. And by the way, in the past, there was one time in the U.S. Census has changed every year. Every year it's taken. And so there's every single year that there's a census, there's a different racial categorization. And in one census, you determine race by the race of the mother. So in that year, going back to Barack Obama, he would have been white under the census that year. Today, he's black because of the definition today. Or he's actually today, he could check whatever he wants, actually, he could, right? But at any rate, but there's an increase in interracial marriage, which has something to do with not required for having children, but it's certainly an incentive. And there is an increase in people who identify as mixed race. And it's a very good question as to what the implications are for the way we define race, for racial equality, racial categorization in this country. Now, I think that as more and more white people have children who are identified as belonging to a different race, that is going to have an impact on how white people think about race and racial inequality. I'm going to have a but in a minute, but I do think that there is an impact that many white people become more aware of institutionalized racism when they have to deal with a child who is not white. They realize, for the first time, they realize what privileges they have had when their child doesn't have those privileges. And that has been reported by many white people who either adopt or bear especially a black child. So that's an effect, that will have an effect. Also, more and more people saying, I don't fit one of those boxes on the census. I can't check black or white or Native American or Asian. I'm a mixture, and I refuse to choose. That has an impact on people's understanding of race. They think there is no such thing as pure race. And so at least my children aren't. So now I'm trying to question this entire concept of racial purity. On the other hand, I don't think it's the case that that alone is going to revolutionize the way we think about race. First of all, it's still a relatively small number of people. Even though interracial marriage, for example, has gone up since the Loving versus Virginia decision in 1967, when it was still constitutional to ban it in the United States, it has only gone up a little bit. I mean, interracial marriages are still a tiny minority of marriages in the United States. And white people are very unlikely to marry someone of another race. They're the least likely people to marry someone of another race. The vast majority of white people in America would not even consider marrying someone of another race. So there's the change is kind of dramatic compared to when it was out, you were a criminal if you married someone of another race, but it's not revolutionary, so the numbers are small. The other is that you can still force people who are of mixed heritage into a box. That's been going on for black people since black people arrived in the United States. So there have been, from the very beginning. We could take Thomas Jefferson as an example, and that white slaveholders have raped enslaved women and had mixed children. That was very common from the 1700s in the United States. It was common in the 1600s. There was one of the very first laws passed in the United States was a law in the 1600s in Virginia that started with the preamble. I'm paraphrasing a bit, but something like, it has come to our attention that we need to decide what is the status of children born to a Negro woman fathered by an Englishman. This is even before there was the United States, so these were English colonists. So, 1600s, what do we call these children? Because there were so many of them. And they decide, the law was they have the status of the mother, so they could be enslaved. And Thomas Jefferson enslaved his black children. So if you can enslave your black child, don't tell me that having a child of another race is going to liberate them. It's not. It doesn't do that naturally or automatically. You have to have the political understanding and desire for it to make a difference. And this has been shown in studies of white mothers with black children, that some of those mothers ignore race. They don't want to believe that their child is of a different race. They keep pretending that race doesn't matter. But there are some white mothers who are enlightened, and they do not like the fact that their child is being discriminated against. And they use it as a platform to change their views about race. And they become opposed to white privilege and racial discrimination. But it's not automatic, and it's not for everybody. So and just taking that at a societal level, I think that the existence of more and more mixed race people, people who identify as mixed race, can have an impact. It can contribute, but it's not by itself enough. It has to be an enlightening experience that leads to a political decision to oppose racism and white supremacy. Doesn't have to, but it can.
We have time for one more question.
Sure, I'm happy to.
A gentleman in the back.
Oh.
You talked about America, and that's been very powerful.
Yes.
You ever thinking about, in a global perspective, someone like Brazil with this?
Yeah.
What do medical scientists in those places, India, South Africa?
Right, yeah. That's a good question. So this is something I am only beginning to explore. I didn't, for my book Fatal Invention, I really focused on the United States, although I do note that one of the very powerful pieces of evidence that race is not a biological category is that it's defined differently in different countries around the world. And so in Brazil, for example, which you mentioned, there are numerous categories for people who are mixtures of white and European and African. It's not one or the other. It depends on appearance, it depends on the amount of African or European ancestry, lots of different things, but there are many, many categories. And in South Africa, of course, there was white, black, and colored. It wasn't the same categories that we have in the United States. Now, how does that affect medical practice? Well, it depends on the policy in the country. Again, the racial concept of disease isn't natural. It's a policy. There's a decision to practice medicine in that way, or to do research on biology that way. So in France, for example, it is taking race into account in biomedical research funded by the government is barred. Medical researchers cannot. And the woman who asked me about NIH is left, but I mentioned NIH, and she mentioned requires researchers to categorize research subjects by race. In France, you cannot do that with government funding. It's the opposite as in the United States, because they have a philosophy. I'm not saying it's totally reflected in the reality of race relations in France, but they have a philosophy that you are French. We are all French citizens, and they think that if you categorize people by race, you are going to divide people. And so they have an ideology and a government stance that we will not take race into account. And so I think there are shifts, political shifts, that philosophy is being contested in France. There is a growing black political movement in Brazil that has an effect on these questions. In India, there is an increased interest in genetic difference, a lot of genetic research going on there right now. There are some researchers that are looking at caste. There it's not race, it's caste. And some researchers mimicking all that I talked about in the United States and looking for genetic differences between castes. In fact, there's a professor at Penn, Projit Mukherjee, who is doing research on genetic developments in India, and he told me that he discovered a scientist there that is exploring caste-based medicine based on the Bidil experience in the United States. So different societies have different approaches to this based on their history of race and racism and their current politics. And so I'll mention that my program on race science and society is planning a conference in spring of 2018 on race science and society from a global perspective, where we're inviting researchers from around the world to discuss these very questions of how race is defined and treated and looked at either as a biological concept, a social concept, and the implications for various societies around the world? It's a great question that needs to be explored more.
Thank you so much, Dorothy. That was
Sure.
fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thanks.